All right, ready to dive deep into how drugs actually work. We've got your sources here. Looks like some serious pharmaceutical science stuff. Think receptors, enzymes, even the journey a drug takes through your body.
Oh yeah, it's a fascinating invisible world,
It
really.
is. So let's get right into it. When you swallow a pill, what's that first hurdle it has to clear?
Well, think of it like this. Before a drug can work its magic, it has to get from your stomach into your bloodstream. It's like a tiny traveler trying to cross a busy border.
Gotcha. So it needs the right paperwork to get through.
Exactly. Needs the right passport, good solubility to dissolve in your body's fluids, and permeability to squeeze through those cell walls.
That makes sense. It's not like dropping something in your stomach and it just appears in your blood.
No, no, no. And get this. The size of the drug particle matters too. Smaller particles dissolve faster, like imagine finely ground coffee versus those big chunky beans.
Ah, okay. So the drug's packaging, tablet, capsule, liquid, all that plays a role too.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting is what you eat can actually change the game too. Some foods can enhance absorption, while others can block it entirely. Ever wonder why some meds have that warning, take on an empty stomach?
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about the drug itself, but the whole environment inside the body.
Precisely. And another key player is stomach acid. You know how potent that stuff is. Some drugs get broken down by it, while others actually need that acidic bath to dissolve.
Wow, so even something as basic as pH levels matters.
You bet. It's a delicate dance between the drug and your physiology. And here's another layer. Even those inactive ingredients in drugs, what we call excipients, they can affect how a drug dissolves and gets absorbed.
So every little thing matters, huh?
Oh, yeah. And scientists carefully select those excipients to fine-tune the entire process.
Okay, so let's say our tiny traveler has made it through all that, crossed the border into the bloodstream.
Yep.
What's next?
Well, now it's off on a grand tour of your circulatory system. We call this distribution. Some drugs, like those targeting the brain, got across even tougher borders, like the blood-brain barrier that's like Fort Knox for your brain.
Sounds intense. So once it reaches its destination, what happens then?
That's when the real action starts. It interacts with its target, usually a protein, like a receptor or an enzyme.
Okay, so this is where it gets to the how drugs actually work part. Can you break that down for us? Receptors, enzymes, how does all that fit together?
Think of receptors as tiny locks on your cells and drugs as keys. When a drug binds to a receptor, boom, triggers a response inside the cell. Some drugs, called agonists, activate those receptors, like flipping a switch on. Others, antagonists, block them, switching them off.
So it's like a communication system, the drug sending a signal.
Exactly. Like morphine, that potent painkiller, it's an agonist at opioid receptors in your brain, kicking off a whole chain reaction that leads to pain relief.
Okay, that makes sense. What about enzymes then? Where do they come in?
Enzymes are like tiny machines speeding up chemical reactions. Imagine them as chefs in a busy kitchen, chopping, mixing, creating those delicious dishes. Drugs can either boost or block enzyme activity, like adding a spice or an ingredient that changes the flavor.
Right, so it's like telling the chef what to cook.
Exactly. Like aspirin, for example. It blocks an enzyme called COX, involved in making those substances that cause pain and inflammation. By blocking COX, aspirin reduces those symptoms.
So basically, aspirin tells the chef, hold the hot peppers.
Precisely. But here's where things get really interesting. Some drugs can act as what we call biased agonists.
Biased agonist. Now that sounds intriguing. What does that even mean?
Well, we used to think of receptors as simple on-off switches, but it's more nuanced than that. Receptors can activate multiple pathways in a cell, like a control panel with different buttons. Biased agonists can hit specific buttons, activating certain pathways while ignoring others.
So it's not just on or off, it's about fine-tuning the whole control panel.
Exactly. This is a big deal for drug development. Imagine creating drugs that target only the beneficial pathways and skip those pesky side effects.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
But speaking of side effects, if drugs are so precise, how come they sometimes cause those unwanted effects?
Ideally, we want drugs to hit only their intended target. But sometimes they bind to other proteins in the body, like a key fitting into the wrong lock. We call these off-target effects, and they can lead to those unwanted side effects.
Like a molecular case of mistaken identity.
Exactly. The more selective a drug is, meaning the better it sticks to its target and ignores the others, the less likely it is to have those off-target effects.
So how do they even figure out a drug's selectivity? Is it just trial and error?
It's a mix of careful design and testing. Scientists use some pretty cool techniques to study how drugs interact with different proteins in the lab. And during clinical trials, they watch patients closely for any unexpected side
So
effects.
it's a constant process of improvement. This is all so fascinating. I never realized how much science goes into just taking a pill.
Oh, it's an amazing journey, and we've just scratched the
I
surface.
can't wait to dive deeper.
Well, next, we can talk about what happens to the drug after it's done its job. It's not just a one-way trip. The body breaks down and eliminates drugs. We call this metabolism and excretion, or ADME for short.
ADME. Huh. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, let's start with metabolism. Your liver is the MVP here. It's like a detox center. It transforms drugs into metabolites, which are usually easier to get rid of. Think of it like breaking down a complex machine into smaller
So
parts.
like the body's way of recycling the drug.
That's a great way to put it. Then there's excretion, how those metabolites exit the body. Your kidneys do a lot of heavy lifting here, filtering waste into your urine. But drugs can also leave through sweat, breath, even breast milk.
Wow, the body has so many ways of dealing with these substances.
It really does. And just like absorption, these ADME processes can vary from person to person. Age, genetics, diet, other medications. It all affects how your body handles a drug.
So what works for one person might not work the same way for another.
That's the thing about pharmacology. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Understanding these individual differences is key to personalized medicine, where treatments are tailored to each person's unique needs.
It's like putting all the puzzle pieces together. This whole journey of a drug through the body is so much more complex and fascinating than I ever imagined.
Absolutely. And we haven't even talked about the world of pharmaceutical development, where scientists use all this knowledge to design better medications.
That sounds like a whole other deep dive waiting to happen, and I'm eager to hear more.
Well, let's keep exploring then. It's pretty amazing how much goes into designing those pills and capsules we take. It's a whole field, pharmaceutical product development.
Okay, let's break that down. What exactly does pharmaceutical product development involve?
It's all about optimizing drug delivery. How do we get the right amount of medication to the right place at the right time? And that means considering everything we've talked about, solubility, permeability, even those ADME processes.
So it's more than just finding a drug that works, it's also about delivering it effectively.
Exactly. And that's where things like different types of pills, capsules, patches, inhalers, all that comes into play.
Yeah, makes sense. So each delivery system has its own pros and cons, I guess.
Exactly. Remember those time release capsules we mentioned earlier?
Oh yeah, the ones that release medication slowly over time.
Those are designed very precisely to keep drug levels consistent in your body. Avoid those peaks and valleys you might get with a regular pill.
That's really clever. But how do scientists actually design these optimized dosage forms? It seems incredibly complex.
It is complex, but it's really fascinating too. It all starts with a deep understanding of how the drug behaves in the body. Scientists use computer simulations to model drug behavior. Then they test those predictions in the lab using high-tech equipment to measure things like how fast the drug dissolves and how well it can pass through barriers.
So it's a mix of scientific knowledge, experimentation, and real-world observation.
Right. And it often involves a whole team of experts, chemists, biologists, engineers, even statisticians. One of your sources talks about developing a controlled release version of the drug nifedipine.
Nifedipine, I think I've heard of that. Isn't that a blood pressure medication?
Yes, exactly. It's often prescribed for high blood pressure, but the original version had a bit of a problem. It got absorbed too quickly, leading to those rapid changes in blood pressure.
Yeah, that sounds like a problem. How do they solve that then?
They created a controlled release formulation using something called an osmotic pump. Picture a tiny capsule with a membrane that lets some molecules through but not others. Inside, you have the drug and a special core that attracts water.
Okay, so water can get in, but the drug can't get out yet.
Right. As water goes in, it creates pressure that pushes the drug out through a tiny opening, kind of like a miniature time-release sprinkler system. With this new formulation, they were able to smooth out those blood pressure fluctuations and reduce side effects.
That's incredible. What a clever solution. It really shows how much science goes into seemingly simple things like taking a pill.
It does. And it all goes back to those basic principles: solubility, permeability, ADME. Speaking of which, there's a system scientists use to classify drugs based on these properties. It's called the Biopharmaceutics Classification System, or BCS.
ECS, tell me more like that.
Well, the BCS is like a roadmap for drug developers. It groups drugs into 4 classes based on their solubility and permeability. Class 1 drugs are the easy ones: high solubility and high permeability. No problem getting those absorbed.
So they're the well-behaved, easy-to-absorb drugs.
Exactly. Then you have class 2, low solubility but high permeability. Those can be a bit trickier. They might not dissolve well enough.
Ah, so that's where particle size and formulation become really crucial.
You got it. Class 3 drugs are the opposite. They dissolve easily but have a hard time getting through those cellular barriers. So for these, scientists focus on boosting permeability. And then there's class 4. Those are the tough ones. Low solubility and low permeability. Very hard to absorb effectively.
Those must keep the scientists busy.
They do. But the BCS is really helpful. It gives them clues on how to best formulate and deliver these challenging drugs. Next time you look at a medication label, you might even see its BCS class mentioned.
That's really interesting. I'll have to look out for that. It's like a secret code to understand how drugs behave in the body.
It is. It just highlights how much thought and research goes into making these medications. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to share with you. It's the concept of in vitro in vivo correlation, IVIVC for short.
IVIVC, that sounds intriguing. What's that about?
It's a way of connecting what happens in the lab to what happens in the body. Basically, it's about figuring out if a drug's dissolution rate in the lab can predict how well it will be absorbed in a person.
Like a test run before the real performance.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. IVIVC is really useful because it lets scientists predict how a drug will behave in the body based on its lab performance.
So does that make drug development faster?
It can. If there's a strong IVIVC, it might be possible to streamline the process and skip some clinical trials, saving a ton of time and money.
Makes sense, but how do they even establish that correlation? Is it just comparing numbers?
It's a bit more involved than that. They use math models to analyze the data from both the lab and the real-world studies. It's kind of like putting together a puzzle, using the lab results to predict how the drug will act in the body.
This is starting to sound like a detective story.
Haha, it does, doesn't it? And when they find a strong correlation, it's a big win.
I had no idea there was so much science behind developing safe and effective medications. This is all new to me.
It's a fascinating field, isn't it? And the more we learn, the better we can develop treatments tailored to each person's specific needs.
You mentioned personalized medicine before. Can you tell us a bit more about that? It sounds like the ultimate goal of all this research.
It really is the holy grail of pharmacology. Imagine a world where we can predict how someone will respond to a medication before they even take it, all based on their unique genetic makeup, lifestyle, and other factors.
That would be revolutionary for healthcare.
Definitely. And with all the progress we've made in understanding drug absorption, metabolism, all those interactions, we're getting closer to that vision every day.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of how drugs work.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a testament to how incredible the human body is and the power of science.
We've really gone deep on this one, huh? Learned so much about the crazy journey a drug takes through the body, from absorption to excretion, and all those factors that affect how well it actually works.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always something more going on underneath.
Absolutely. So as we wrap things up here, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this? What's the big picture message about how drugs work?
I think the most important thing to remember is that drugs, they aren't magic bullets. They're powerful tools, but we gotta understand them and use them responsibly.
Yeah, I think that's so important. We often just take medications without thinking much about the science behind them.
And that can lead to some problems. Taking them wrong, mixing them without talking to a doctor. It can really mess with that delicate balance we've been talking about.
So knowledge is power when it comes to our health and the meds we take.
Absolutely. The more we know about how drugs work, the better choices we can make for ourselves.
Well said. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of pharmacology.
I'm glad to hear that. It really is a fascinating field, and there's so much more to learn.
Any last words of wisdom for our listeners before we sign off?
Stay curious. Keep asking questions. Pharmacology is always changing. New discoveries all the time. And the more we learn, the closer we get to that dream of personalized medicine, treatments that are tailored to each person.
That's a great thought to leave on. Thanks for joining us on this incredible exploration of pharmacology. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.